September 28, 1945, a California prisoner of war camp. 127 Japanese women stood frozen in a small infirmary room, watching their youngest companion lie motionless on a hospital bed. They had already said goodbye. They had already mourned. Her chest no longer rose with breath, her skin had lost its warmth. But one American officer refused to accept death. Captain Richard Morrison pushed through the circle of grieving women, dropped to his knees beside the bed, and pressed 2 fingers against the girl's throat. The women watched in confusion as he searched, pressed harder, bent his head to listen. And what happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter everything these women believed about their enemy. How do you hate someone who is fighting to save your sister? But to understand that impossible moment, to understand why those women wept as they watched an American doctor refuse to let their friend die, you need to go back 8 weeks. Back to the beginning. Back to the day they arrived expecting monsters and found something far more dangerous than cruelty. They found mercy. And mercy, as they would discover, was the most powerful weapon of all. When the military transport ship carrying 127 Japanese women approached San Francisco Harbor on the morning of September 5, 1945. The war had been over for exactly 3 weeks. The atomic bombs had fallen, Japan had surrendered. And these women who had served the Imperial Japanese Army in various capacities as translators, nurses, radio operators, and clerks knew they were prisoners now. Knew they were at the mercy of an enemy they had been taught to fear more than death itself. Haruka Tanaka stood near the railing on the lower deck, one hand gripping the cold metal, the other clutching a small cloth bundle that contained everything she owned in the world. A wooden comb, a faded photograph of her parents taken in Tokyo before the war, when the bakery still smelled of fresh bread and children still played in parks that had not yet become ash, and a diary hidden carefully beneath the folds of fabric, where she had written what she believed were her final thoughts. She was 23 years old. She had worked as a military translator at a headquarters in Saipan, and she spoke English well enough to understand the casual conversations of the American soldiers who were now boarding the ship. Well enough to know that they were not talking about torture or execution. They were talking about lunch plans, about baseball scores, about someone's new car. The normalcy of their voices, the casual tone, the complete absence of the hatred she had been promised terrified her more than screaming would have. For months, the propaganda had been clear, relentless, painted in stark images across every radio broadcast and printed order. American soldiers were barbarians. They showed no mercy to prisoners, especially women. Capture meant degradation, torture, death, or worse. The phrase "or worse" had never been defined, left deliberately vague, so that each woman's imagination could fill in the terrible details. Beside Haruka, a 17-year-old girl named Emmy stood trembling. She had been a radio operator, and her small frame seemed to shrink further with each mile that carried them away from home and toward the enemy. Her eyes were hollow, ringed with dark circles from weeks of fear and insufficient sleep aboard the transport ship. An older woman, Fumiko, a former army nurse who was 52 and carried herself with a rigid dignity born of decades of service, placed her hand on Emmy's shoulder and whispered something in Japanese that the Americans would not understand. "Be brave. We face this together." The first thing that hit them as the gangway descended was not the expected stench of a military prison. It was the smell of bread, fresh bread baking somewhere in the city beyond the docks. The scent drifted across the water, mixing with the salt air and the diesel fumes from the trucks lined up on the pier. And for women who had survived on rice balls and seaweed for months, who had watched their rations dwindle as the war turned against Japan, that smell was almost painful. Haruka closed her eyes and breathed it in. For one brief moment, she was transported back to a bakery in Tokyo before the war, before the firebombing, before the hunger, when such smells were common and unremarkable. The memory was so sharp it felt like a physical wound, like a knife pressed against her ribs. Then the woman next to her, another prisoner named Yuki, whispered, "It is a trick. They want us to smell it to make the hunger worse, to break us before they even begin." And Haruka believed her. Of course she believed her. What else could it be? The sounds were equally disorienting. Seagulls cried overhead, their calls mixing with the shouts of dock workers, the rumble of truck engines, the distant clang of a streetcar. But what struck the women most was the tone of the American voices. They were not harsh. They were not cruel. They were ordinary men calling to each other about where to get coffee, about whether the weather would hold, about baseball and home and mundane things. It was the casual normality of a world that had not been bombed into rubble, a world where war was something that happened elsewhere to other people. Visually, the contrast was even more stark. They had left behind the bombed remains of Saipan, where American B-29s had turned buildings to dust and jungles to ash. They had sailed past islands where palm trees stood as blackened skeletons against gray skies. But here the buildings rose intact against a brilliant blue sky. Windows gleamed unbroken and clean. Cars, actual civilian cars, moved through streets. The Golden Gate Bridge stretched in the distance, a monument to engineering and prosperity, and a kind of peace these women could barely remember. American soldiers in clean-pressed uniforms began boarding the ship. Military police with white armbands and pistols holstered at their sides moved up the gangway with practiced efficiency. The women pressed closer together instinctively, a protective huddle born of months of shared fear. Emmy began to tremble visibly, and Fumiko tightened her grip on the girl's shoulders. The lead military policeman, a sergeant with tired eyes and 3 stripes on his sleeve, stopped a few feet from the group. His name, they would later learn, was James Cartwright. He was 28 years old. He had lost his brother Tommy at Iwo Jima just 6 months earlier, in March when Tommy was 19, and full of the kind of righteous anger that war breeds in young men. James Cartwright had carried that anger with him across the Pacific, had nurtured. It had promised himself that if he ever faced the enemy, he would remember Tommy's face, remember the telegram that had arrived at his wife Sarah's door, remember the funeral with the closed casket, because there had not been enough of Tommy left to show. But now looking at these women, some of them younger than Tommy, had been all of them exhausted and terrified and so thin, he could see the bones in their wrists. James Cartwright felt something he had not expected. Not sympathy exactly, not forgiveness, but a kind of confused hesitation, a crack in the certainty he had built around his grief. They waited for the first blow, the first insult, the first sign of the cruelty they had been promised. Instead, Sergeant Cartwright pulled a clipboard from under his arm and said in a flat, bureaucratic voice, "We are going to process you for transport to the detention facility. You will be given medical checks, documentation, and temporary quarters. Follow the instructions of the guards, and there will not be any problems." A translator stepped forward, a Japanese-American woman in a military uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her face carefully neutral. Her name was Lieutenant Grace Nakamura. She had been born in Sacramento. She was loyal to America, had volunteered for military service, had proven herself invaluable in the Pacific theater. But to the prisoners, she was something they could not easily categorize. A Japanese face speaking English with a flawless American accent, wearing the enemy's uniform. Some of the women distrusted her, immediately saw her as a traitor. But others noticed something in her eyes. Not hatred, not triumph, sadness. A deep, complicated sadness that suggested she understood exactly what these women were feeling. Lieutenant Nakamura repeated Sergeant Cartwright's words in Japanese, her voice steady and professional. But Haruka, who understood English, had already heard. And she found herself studying this woman's face, trying to reconcile what she saw with what she had been taught. This woman had chosen the enemy's side. Yet she looked tired and perhaps a bit heartbroken, like someone caught between two worlds with no clear path home to either. It was the first crack in the wall of certainty that Haruka had built around herself. The first small fissure that would, over the coming weeks, widen into something that would reshape everything she believed. They were led down the gangway in a double line, guards on either side. Their legs were weak from weeks at sea, their bodies unsteady on solid ground. The docks stretched before them, wooden planks worn smooth by years of use, and when Haruka's feet touched the pier, she felt a wave of emotion she could not name. Relief that the voyage was over. Fear of what came next. Grief for everything she had lost. All of it mixed together into something that lodged in her throat and made it difficult to breathe. As they walked, civilians stopped to watch. Americans stood at what they clearly considered a safe distance, pointing, whispering to each other. Some faces showed curiosity. Others showed anger. One woman, older with gray hair and a hard expression, spat on the ground as the prisoners passed. Haruka understood that hatred. She had seen what war did, had heard about Pearl Harbor, about American soldiers killed in the Pacific. She had expected much worse than a look of disgust and a gesture of contempt. Yet even that look cut deeper than she thought it would. To be seen as the enemy to be hated by strangers was different than hearing about it in propaganda briefings. It was personal and immediate and impossible to dismiss. They were loaded into covered trucks, 20 women to a vehicle. The canvas sides blocked most of the view, but through gaps in the fabric they caught glimpses of San Francisco passing by. Buildings taller than anything in Tokyo standing undamaged. Shop windows displaying goods in quantities that seemed impossible. Shoes lined up in neat rows. Dresses on mannequins. Canned foods stacked in pyramids. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It was a world that did not match anything they had been told about the enemy. If America was struggling, if the war had drained their resources, as Japanese radio had claimed for years, why did the cities look so prosperous? Why did civilians look so well fed? Why were there goods in the shops and cars on the streets and children playing as if war was something distant and abstract? One woman voiced what others were thinking. Maybe it is just this city. Maybe they are hiding the damage from us. Maybe the rest of America is starving and desperate, and they have concentrated everything here to deceive us. But even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. Even she did not quite believe it. Sergeant James Cartwright rode in the lead truck, sitting up front with the driver, a corporal named Henderson, who had been at Pearl Harbor and still carried shrapnel in his shoulder from the attack. Henderson had every reason to hate these women, every justification for cruelty. But he drove carefully, avoiding potholes, taking turns slowly, so that the prisoners in the back would not be thrown around. Small mercies, unconscious acts of basic decency that neither man acknowledged, but both somehow understood. Cartwright stared out the window as they drove, not really seeing the city passing by. He was thinking about a letter he would write that night to his wife Sarah, back home in Ohio with their 2-year-old daughter Susie. He was trying to figure out how to explain what he was feeling, how to tell her that when he looked at these prisoners, especially the youngest one who could barely walk down the gangplank without stumble, he kept seeing Susie, kept imagining his daughter at 17 terrified and far from home at the mercy of strangers who had every reason to hate her. It made him feel disloyal to Tommy, made him feel like he was betraying his brother's memory by seeing these women as human as individuals, rather than as the faceless enemy Tommy had died fighting. But he could not help it, and that confusion, that moral ambiguity, sat in his chest like a stone. The detention facility was located an hour outside the city, a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers stood at the corners manned by soldiers with rifles. It looked like a prison, which is exactly what it was. But as the trucks passed through the gates and the women got their first full view of the camp, they noticed things that did not fit their expectations. The grounds were swept clean. Grass grew between the barracks, green and well-maintained. There were no signs of deliberate decay or casual cruelty in the camp's construction. Everything was orderly, organized, almost clinical. This was not the hellish prison they had prepared themselves for, with muddy grounds and barbaric conditions designed to break the spirit. It was something else entirely. Efficient, systematic, impersonal in a way that was somehow more unsettling than overt cruelty would have been. They were led to a processing building. Inside they found a scene that might have come from a hospital. White painted walls, clean floors that smelled sharply of antiseptic. Medical personnel in white coats moving between stations with practiced efficiency. The translator to Lieutenant Nakamura explained that each woman would receive a medical examination, have her information recorded, and be issued clean clothing. This was the moment many had feared most. Medical examinations could mean humiliation, violation, degradation. The propaganda had been very clear about what happened to women prisoners, and though the specifics were vague, the implications were terrifying. They stood in line, silent, intense, each one preparing herself for the worst. When Haruka's turn came, she followed a nurse into a curtained area. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands were shaking. She had heard stories, terrible stories, about what happened to women in enemy hands. Stories that had been told in whispers, late at night stories, designed to ensure that surrender was never an option, that death was always preferable to capture. The nurse was a middle-aged woman with gray, streaking her dark hair and lines around her eyes that suggested she smiled often, though she was not smiling now. Her expression was professional, neutral, neither kind nor cruel. Through Lieutenant Nakamura, who stood nearby to translate, the nurse explained each step of the examination: temperature, blood pressure, heart and lungs, a check for obvious illness or injury. The nurse's hands were gentle, not tentative, but practiced, ensure the hands of someone who had examined thousands of patients and understood that touch could communicate either threat or reassurance. When she found the bruises on Haruka's ribs, remnants of a fall during the chaotic evacuation of Saipan, when American bombs were falling and everyone was running, and Haruka had tripped over rubble and slammed into a wall, the nurse made notes on her clipboard but asked no questions that implied judgment or suspicion. At the end of the examination, the nurse handed Haruka a small paper cup containing 2 white pills. Lieutenant Nakamura translated. Vitamins. Many of you are malnourished. These will help. Haruka stared at the pills in her palm. They were small and white and utterly ordinary. Were they vitamins as claimed, or poison, a quick, inefficient way to dispose of prisoners without the mess of execution, or something else, some drug designed to make them compliant, to break their will without breaking their bodies? She had no way to know. No framework for understanding an enemy who offered vitamins instead of violence. In the end, she swallowed the pills because refusal seemed more dangerous than compliance. Because what choice did she have, really? She was a prisoner. She had no power here. She could only hope that the lies she had been told about the Americans were more extensive than she had imagined. After the medical examinations came the part that felt most vulnerable, most dangerous. They were led to shower facilities and told to remove their clothing. This was it, many of them thought. This is where the humiliation begins. This is where we will be degraded, violated, reminded that we are prisoners and enemies and at the mercy of men who owe us nothing. They filed into a large tiled room with shower heads along the walls, maybe 20 in total. Female guards supervised, but they stood back near the doors, not crowding the prisoners, not leering or making the moment more uncomfortable than it already was. They handed out bars of soap, real soap, white and fragrant, and thin towels that were clean, if not luxurious. When Haruka turned on her shower handle, expecting at best a trickle of cold water, hot water poured out. Not warm, hot. Steam rose in clouds. She gasped at the heat of it, at the sudden, overwhelming sensation of genuine warmth on her skin. Around her, other women made similar sounds. Sounds of surprise that quickly turned into something else. Something that resembled pain or grief, or both at once. For months, they had bathed in cold water when they could bathe at all. They had scrubbed with sand when soap was unavailable. They had made do with salt water that left their skin sticky and their hair stiff. This hot water, this real soap that lathered thick and white and smelled like flowers, a scent so at odds with everything they had experienced in the last year that it felt almost obscene, felt almost sinful in its comfort. Haruka stood under the spray and let it wash away layers of grime, sweat, salt, fear. The soap lathered in her hands. She rubbed it over her arms, her face, her hair, and the simple act of being clean, truly clean, hit her with unexpected force. Her throat tightened, her eyes stung, and before she could stop herself, she was crying. Around her, other women wept too. Some quietly, tears mixing with the water streaming down their faces. Others openly, shoulders shaking, hands pressed against the tile walls for support. Whether they cried from relief or confusion, or the simple release of finally being clean, no one could say. Perhaps it was all three. Perhaps it was the realization that their bodies had forgotten what kindness felt like, that they had been living in survival mode for so long that this basic human comfort felt like a luxury they did not deserve. Outside the shower building, Sergeant James Cartwright stood smoking a cigarette. He had not meant to be there, had been walking past on his rounds. But he could hear the sounds through the walls. The crying, not screaming, not the sounds of violence or assault, just crying. The kind of crying that comes from deep inside, from a place beyond words. Cook Henderson, the Pearl Harbor veteran who had driven the truck, stood nearby. He lit his own cigarette and said quietly, "They are just getting clean, Jimmy." "When was the last time you cried in the shower?" Cartwright did not answer, did not tell Henderson about the night he got Sarah's telegram about Tommy, about how he had stood in the shower in the barracks and let the water run until it went cold because he could not stop the sounds coming out of his own chest. Did not tell him that he understood exactly why these women were crying, that he recognized that particular kind of grief, the kind that comes when your body remembers comfort, You thought you had lost forever. He crushed his cigarette under his boot and walked away. That night, he would sit down with pen and paper and write to Sarah. The letter would be difficult to write, full of crossed-out words and false starts, because how do you explain to your wife that you are starting to see the enemy as human? Dear Sarah, he would write. Processed 127 of them today. Women, some younger than Tommy was. I wanted to hate them. Orders say treat them by the book Geneva Convention, and I do. But Sarah, when I heard that youngest one crying over hot water, when I heard them all crying, because they were clean for the first time in months, I thought about Susie. I thought about our daughter at bath time, the way she laughs when the water is just right, the way she trusts us to take care of her. And God help me, I cannot hate children, even enemy children. What does that make me? What would Tommy think? He would not mail that letter for 3 days, would read it over and over, would almost tear it up twice, but eventually he would send it because he needed Sarah to help him make sense of what he was feeling, needed her to tell him that mercy was not betrayal, that seeing the humanity in the enemy did not dishonor his brother's memory. Clean and dressed in simple cotton dresses and undergarments that were worn but whole, they were led to the mess hall. The building was plain but well-maintained, with long tables and attached benches running the length of the room. At one end, a serving line had been set up. Steam rose from metal containers, and the smell hit them before they even entered the building. Cooked rice, vegetables, some kind of meat, real food, hot food, more food than they had seen in months. More food than many of them had eaten in a single meal since before the war turned against Japan, before the American submarines cut off supply lines, before the bombing started, and the rations dwindled to almost nothing. They formed a line automatically, years of military discipline, making the movement instinctive even in these strange circumstances. As they shuffled forward, Haruka could see the servers. American soldiers in aprons wielding large serving spoons with the casual efficiency of men who had done this job many times before. Each woman received a metal tray divided into sections. Into these sections went a mound of white rice perfectly cooked, slightly sticky, real rice without the husks and dirt that had filled the last bags they received in Saipan. Steamed carrots and peas bright with color and butter. A piece of baked chicken with skin still on it. Fat, glistening meat that smelled of salt and herbs and richness. And a slice of white bread and with a pat of butter melting into its surface. Haruka accepted her tray with both hands. It was heavy. The rice alone was more than she had eaten in a day for the past month. She carried it to a table where Emmy and several others had already sat, and they stared at their trays in silence. Around the room, the same scene repeated. Women sitting motionless, looking at food they could not quite believe was meant for them, food that seemed too good to be real food, that had to be a trick or a test or something other than what it appeared to be. Maybe it is drugs, someone whispered. Maybe they will poison only this first meal to make it easier to dispose of us, to make us die in our sleep without struggle. The fear was real, palpable, sitting heavy in the air. But so was the hunger, the gnawing, constant, months-long hunger that had become so familiar they barely noticed it anymore, except in moments like this, when confronted with abundance, when forced to remember what it felt like to want food not just for survival, but for the pleasure of eating. One by one they began to eat. Haruka picked up her fork. They had been given forks, not chopsticks, and the unfamiliar utensil felt awkward in her hand. But she managed and tried a small bite of rice. It was perfectly cooked. No grit, no husks. Just clean, white, properly steamed rice with a texture she had almost forgotten. She tried the chicken next. The meat was tender, seasoned with salt and herbs she could not identify. Fat and moisture met her tongue, and her body, starved for protein and calories, responded with an intensity that was almost painful. She had to stop herself from eating too fast, from making herself sick. Around her, others faced the same struggle. Some ate slowly, trying to savor every bite, trying to make it last. Others devoured their food with desperate speed, as if afraid it might be taken away, as if this might be the only real meal they would ever have again. Emmy, the youngest, the most frightened, began to cry quietly as she ate. Tears ran down her cheeks, dripping onto her tray, mixing with the food, but she did not stop eating. Fumiko, the former nurse, with the rigid dignity, and the husband captured by Russians in Manchuria, reached over and squeezed Emmy's hand. No words were spoken. No words were needed. They all felt it. The confusion of being fed well by those they had been taught to see as monsters. the guilt of eating meat while their families starved, the terror of not knowing if this kindness was real or the cruelest trick of all. When Haruka finished, her stomach felt uncomfortably full. She could not remember the last time she had experienced that sensation, the feeling of having eaten enough, of having eaten more than enough. A guard walked through the mess hall with a pitcher offering to refill water glasses. Water glasses. They had been given glass cups, not tin cans or dirty wooden bowls, but actual glass cups like civilians used, like people used in restaurants and homes in the time before war, made everything scarce. The small details accumulated, each one chipping away at the certainty they had carried with them from Japan, each one creating doubt where before there had been only fear and hatred and grim determination. That night, lying in her bunk in the women's barracks, Haruka pulled out her diary and wrote by the dim light of a single bulb that hung from the ceiling. The barracks were long wooden buildings with rows of bunk beds lining both walls. Each woman had been assigned a bed with a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 wool blankets. By prison standards, it was almost comfortable. By the standards of what they had been led to expect, by the standards of the torture and degradation they had been promised, it was incomprehensible. Today, we were processed as prisoners, Haruka wrote in careful characters. We were given soap that smells of flowers, hot water that feels like luxury, and food that makes us weep. I do not understand this enemy. I do not understand what they want from us. Is kindness a strategy, a way to make us compliant before the real torture begins? Or have we been lied to about who they are? I am afraid to believe it is the latter, because that would mean everything I thought I knew was false. That would mean the war, the suffering, all of it was based on lies. And I do not know if I can bear that truth. She closed the diary and tucked it under her pillow. Above her bunk, she could hear Fumiko shifting, unable to sleep. Below her, Emmy breathed in a rhythm that suggested she had finally found rest. Outside guards patrolled the perimeter. The sound of their boots on gravel punctuated the night at regular intervals. But they did not shout threats. They did not bang on the barracks walls to frighten the prisoners. They simply walked their routes, professional and distant, their restraint somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been. In the guard tower, Sergeant James Cartwright sat smoking another cigarette, watching the camp, thinking about the letter he had written, thinking about Tommy and Sarah and Susie and these women who were supposed to be the enemy, but who cried over hot showers and looked at food like it was a miracle. Thinking about the Geneva Convention, the document his father had told him about before he shipped out. We are not like them, his father had said. We follow rules even when they do not. That is what makes us American. That is what separates us from barbarism. And Cartwright, sitting in the darkness watching over prisoners who had been enemies just weeks ago, wondered if his father was right, wondered if mercy was strength or weakness, wondered if Tommy dying on that beach at Iwo Jima would have wanted him to hate these women or to treat them with the dignity that the rules demanded. He did not know the answer, but he knew that tomorrow he would wake up and do his job according to the regulations, according to the Geneva Convention, according to the promise that America had made about how prisoners would be treated. And somehow in the gap between what these women expected and what they received, in the space between cruelty and mercy, something was beginning to shift. Something fragile and complicated and dangerous. The enemy was becoming human. And once you saw someone as human, once you cried when they cried and felt relief when they were fed, everything became more difficult. Hatred was simple. Mercy was hard. And both sides, captor and captive, were beginning to discover just how hard it could be. The days settled into a pattern that felt stranger than chaos would have. Each morning began with a bell at 6:30. They rose from their bunks, washed in communal bathrooms that had running water and actual sinks with mirrors, and dressed in the simple clothes the camp provided. Breakfast was served at 7. Oatmeal or rice porridge, toast with butter or jam, sometimes eggs, always coffee or tea. The portions were generous. No one went hungry. And that fact alone was more disorienting than any interrogation could have been. After breakfast came work assignments. Unlike male prisoners of war, who were sent to labor in fields or factories building roads or harvesting crops, the women's work was lighter. Some were assigned to the camp, laundry washing and pressing linens and uniforms in buildings that smelled of soap and steam. Others worked in the kitchen, preparing meals under the supervision of American cooks, who treated them with professional detachment, neither cruel nor particularly kind, just focused on getting the work done efficiently. A few women with English skills were asked to help in the camp administration office, translating documents or organizing files. Haruka was assigned to the library detail. The camp had a small library that served both guards and prisoners, a collection of books in English and surprisingly in Japanese. Old novels and poetry collections that someone somewhere in the American military bureaucracy had decided were appropriate for enemy prisoners to read. Haruka spent her mornings organizing these books, checking them in and out, keeping the reading room tidy. It was quiet work, almost peaceful. She had time to think, perhaps too much time. Time to wonder about the Japanese books, about where they had come from, about who in the American system had cared enough to provide prisoners with literature in their own language. Time to read the spines and remember a world before war when books were just books and not evidence of a confusing mercy. In the kitchen, 17-year-old Emmy worked under the supervision of Cook Henderson, the Pearl Harbor veteran, with shrapnel still lodged in his shoulder and 3 fingers missing from his left hand. Henderson was 45 years old, had a wife and 3 sons back in Tennessee, and had every reason in the world to hate the Japanese. He had been on the deck of the USS Arizona when the bombs fell. He had watched friends burn. He had spent 3 months in a hospital learning to use his hand again with 2 fingers gone. But in the kitchen, teaching this scared kid how to measure flour and knead dough, how to make American-style biscuits that rose light and fluffy instead of dense and hard, Henderson found himself doing something he had not expected. He was teaching, just teaching, treating her like any other kitchen assistant who needed to learn the job. "Your first attempt came out hard as rocks," he said through Lieutenant Nakamura, who translated during work hours when needed. "You are kneading the dough like you are angry at it. Biscuits need a gentle touch, like this. Watch." He demonstrated his damaged hand working the dough with surprising grace despite the missing fingers. Emmy watched carefully, then tried again. Her second attempt was better. Not perfect, but better. And when Henderson tasted one and said, "Now that is more like it, kid," Emmy smiled. It was the first time anyone in the camp had seen her smile since she arrived. A small, hesitant smile, but genuine. In the laundry, Fumiko worked with other older women, the physical labor keeping her body occupied, while her mind churned with questions she did not want to ask. She had been a nurse in the Imperial Army. She had treated wounded soldiers, had watched young men die, had told them they were dying with honor, dying for the Emperor, dying for a cause that was just and right. But here, washing American uniforms, seeing the care with which they were maintained, seeing the organization and efficiency of everything in the camp, she began to wonder about the things she had been told, began to wonder about the lies she might have spread without knowing they were lies. They were paid for their work. Not much, just a few dollars a week in camp script that could not be used outside the facility, but paid nonetheless. The camp had a canteen where this script could be used to buy small luxuries: chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper, and stamps, toiletries. Small things that in the world before war would have been unremarkable, but here felt like evidence of something they did not yet have words for. The first time Haruka held a Hershey's chocolate bar in her hand, purchased with money she had earned as a prisoner, she stared at it for a full minute before carefully unwrapping the brown paper. The chocolate was sweet, almost too sweet, and it melted on her tongue with a richness her body had nearly forgotten. It was a small thing, just candy, but it felt like evidence of a world that still had room for sweetness, for pleasure, for small indulgences that served no practical purpose except to make life slightly more bearable. She bought stamps too, stamps to write letters home to her family in Tokyo, to her mother and father and younger sister Keiko, if they were still alive. The camp allowed prisoners to send mail, though it was read and censored, and responses, if they came at all, took months. But the fact that they were allowed to write, that the Americans facilitated this communication, rather than cutting them off completely from everyone they loved, and was another detail that did not fit the narrative of barbarism and cruelty. From his guard post, Sergeant James Cartwright watched Haruka buy that chocolate bar, watched her stare at it like it was something precious and dangerous at once, watched her buy stamps and writing paper, and he realized what she was doing. She was writing home, to family who were starving, to parents and siblings who were living in the bombed-out ruins of Tokyo, eating whatever scraps they could find, burning furniture to stay warm. And she was standing here in an American prison camp eating chocolate bought with American money, guarded by American soldiers, living in conditions that were better, objectively better than what her own military had provided her in Saipan, certainly better than what her family was experiencing in the ruins of their country. What kind of torture was that? What kind of psychological warfare made someone comfortable and fed and safe while their loved ones suffered? It seemed crueler than beating her would have been. Crueler because it was not meant to be cruel at all. It was just the rules, just the Geneva Convention being followed to the letter. In late October, about 7 weeks after the women arrived, the letters from Japan began to come. They arrived in batches, thin paper that was rationed and precious, covered in careful handwriting, that tried to say everything while knowing that censors on both sides would read every word. Haruka received a letter from her younger sister Keiko, and when she opened it, her hands were shaking. "Dear Haruka," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well. I hope you are safe. Mother is ill, but there is no medicine. The hospitals have nothing. We eat sweet potato leaves and watered-down miso soup. Sometimes we find rice with too many stones in it, but we eat it anyway. Father's factory was destroyed in the bombing. He searches for work every day, but there is nothing. The city is ash. The buildings are gone. We sleep in a shelter made from pieces of our old house and sheets of metal we found. We are cold, but we are alive. We are grateful you are alive even as a prisoner. At least you eat. At least you are warm. At least you are not here to see what has become of home. Please survive, Haruka. You are all we have left to hope for. Your loving sister Keiko." Haruka read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. That night at dinner, she looked at the food on her tray: a slice of meatloaf, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, bread with butter, and she felt physically sick with guilt. Her family was eating sweet potato leaves. Her mother was ill without medicine. Her father was searching through rubble for work that did not exist. Her sister was cold and hungry and sleeping in a makeshift shelter. And Haruka was here eating meatloaf, real meat with fat and flavor, mashed potatoes made with milk and butter, bread that was soft and white and fresh. The enemy was feeding her better than her own country ever had, better than her own military had fed her when she worked for them, better than her family was eating now. How did she write back? What could she possibly say? That she had chocolate today, that she took a hot shower, that she was treated with more dignity as a prisoner than she had been as a loyal servant of the emperor? She could not bring herself to write those words, could not tell Keiko the truth. So that night, when she sat down with her purchased paper and her purchased pen, she wrote only, "I am well. I am safe. I think of you constantly. I hope mother recovers. I hope father finds work. I carry you all in my heart. Your loving sister Haruka." She was not alone in this hell. Across the barracks, similar scenes played out. Women read letters from home and wept. They felt the weight of survival pressing down on them like a physical force, crushing and inescapable. Some stopped eating as much, trying in some irrational way to save food, even though they knew it would just be thrown away, not sent to Japan, not used to feed their starving families. Others ate with mechanical efficiency, divorcing themselves from the emotional reality of the act, treating food as fuel and nothing more. The guilt was crushing, but it was also transformative, because guilt required thinking, required questioning, required asking why their families were starving while they were fed, required examining the narrative they had been given about American cruelty and Japanese righteousness and what this war was really about. As weeks passed, small moments of human connection began to breach the wall between captor and captive. The first significant one happened in the library where Haruka worked. One afternoon, a young American soldier came in looking for a book. He could not have been more than 20 years old. His name tag read Miller. He was clearly off duty, wearing casual clothes, a simple shirt and trousers, and he browsed the shelves with the unself-conscious comfort of someone who genuinely loved reading. Haruka was shelving books nearby, trying to be invisible the way prisoners learn to be, moving quietly and keeping her eyes down. But Private Miller noticed her and did something unexpected. He nodded politely and said in badly accented, grammatically broken Japanese, "Good afternoon." Haruka was so surprised she forgot to be cautious. She looked up, met his eyes, and replied in careful English, "Good afternoon." Miller's face lit up with a smile. "You speak English." It was not a question, just an observation delivered with something like delight, as if he had discovered something interesting. Haruka nodded. I was a translator. Then she wondered if that was dangerous information to share, if admitting she had worked in military intelligence made her more valuable or more vulnerable. But Miller just said, that must be useful here, in a tone that suggested genuine interest rather than interrogation. Then he went back to browsing, found the mystery novel he was looking for, checked it out with Haruka handling the process efficiently, and left with another polite nod. The entire interaction lasted maybe 3 minutes. But it stuck with Haruka for days. He had spoken to her like a person, not an enemy, not a prisoner, not a curiosity or a threat or a responsibility. Just a person who spoke English and could help him find a book. The distinction felt enormous. Similar moments happened throughout the camp. A guard named Patterson, who worked the perimeter, shared his cigarettes with women tending the small garden where they grew vegetables to supplement the kitchen supplies. He did not say much, just left the pack on the fence post and walked away. But the gesture was understood. In the kitchen, Cook Henderson taught Emmy not just how to make biscuits, but how to make apple pie, peeling apples with his damaged hand and showing her how to crimp the crust, laughing when her first attempt leaked, filling all over the oven. That laugh, genuine and warm, was the sound of a man teaching a skill he cared about, not the sound of a captor humiliating a prisoner. One afternoon, Fumiko was in the laundry room alone washing an American soldier's uniform. She saw the name tag sewn onto the chest. Yoshida, a Japanese name. A Japanese-American soldier who had bled for America, who wore the uniform she had been taught to see as evil, who had chosen the enemy's side and fought for them. She held that uniform in her hands for a long time, feeling the fabric, seeing where it had been mended, seeing the stains that laundry soap could not quite remove. And something broke inside her. Some certainty she had clung to about who was right and who was wrong, about which side was good and which was evil. She sat down on the floor of the laundry room and wept. Not quietly, not with dignity. She wept with her whole body's shoulders shaking, sounds coming from deep in her chest, sounds of grief and confusion and a lifetime of belief coming apart at the seams. That was how Sergeant Cartwright found her. He had been walking past, heard the crying, opened the door to check if someone was hurt. He saw this older woman, this dignified former nurse, who had maintained such rigid control, sitting on the floor, surrounded by wet laundry, weeping like her heart was breaking. He stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to do. Then he asked awkwardly, through the open door, "Ma'am, do you need the medic? Is someone hurt?" Fumiko looked up at him, and for the first time since arriving, she really saw him. Not as a guard, not as the enemy, but as a young man who looked concerned, who looked like he genuinely wanted to help, who was asking if she needed medical attention, because he could not imagine any other reason for this level of grief. She tried to speak in English, words she had learned but rarely used. "My husband," she managed. "Prisoner in Russia." You think she paused, searching for words they feed him? The question hung in the air between them. It was not really a question about her husband. It was a question about whether the mercy she was receiving was unique or universal, whether the rules applied everywhere or only here, whether what she was experiencing was American exceptionalism or just the luck of where she had been captured. Cartwright was quiet for a moment. Then he said honestly, "I do not know, ma'am. I hope so. I hope whoever has him is following the same rules we follow here." He left his pack of cigarettes on the table, not saying anything more, just leaving them there and walking away. It was not much, but it was acknowledgement. It was one human being recognizing another's pain, and that was something Fumiko had not expected from the enemy. That night in the barracks, a debate broke out. It started when one of the younger women mentioned that the camp library had American newspapers available for those who could read English. Several of the women, including Haruka, had been reading them, trying to understand what the American public was being told about the war, about Japan, about the future. The younger women wanted to know what the papers said. They wanted to know how America was portraying Japan, what was being written about the occupation, about rebuilding, about the future of the Pacific. "It is all propaganda," Fumiko said firmly. "They want us to believe Japan was wrong, that we deserved what happened. We cannot trust enemy newspapers. Everything they print is designed to make us doubt, to make us turn against our own people." But Emmy, who was usually quiet and deferential, who rarely spoke up in group discussions, surprised everyone by saying, "But if American newspapers are propaganda, then were not Japanese newspapers propaganda too?" Somebody lied to us. Maybe both sides lied. Maybe everyone lied. The statement hung in the air, radical in its simplicity. If both sides had lied, then truth became complicated. It was no longer black and white, us versus them, good versus evil. It became muddy and morally ambiguous and human in all the ways that war tried to deny. Some of the women nodded slowly. Others looked away, unwilling to engage with such dangerous thoughts, unwilling to question everything they had believed. Haruka found herself speaking before she could stop herself, before she could think about whether it was wise or safe. "They treat us well here," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Better than we expected. Better than our own army treated us toward the end, if we are being honest. Does that make them good, or does it just make them practical?" "I do not know anymore. I do not know what to believe." Her voice cracked on the last sentence, emotion breaking through her careful control. An uncomfortable silence followed. Then slowly, tentatively, others began to share their own confusions and contradictions. One woman admitted she had smiled at a guard's joke yesterday and felt guilty about it. For hours, felt like she was betraying something sacred by finding humor in the enemy's words. Another confessed she looked forward to meals, now not just for the food, but for the brief conversations with the kitchen staff, for the moment of human connection that came with someone asking if she wanted coffee or tea. A third said she had been thinking about staying in America after the war ended, if that was allowed, because what did she have to go home to? What was left in Japan except ash and hunger, and memories of everything that had been lost? These confessions were risky. Even among prisoners, there was fear of being seen as a traitor, fear of betraying the group by admitting what many privately felt. But once the first confession was made, others followed. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing pent-up thoughts and feelings that had been building for weeks. Outside the barracks on patrol, Sergeant James Cartwright stood near an open window and heard everything. He had not meant to eavesdrop. He was just doing his rounds. But he could not help but hear their voices, could not help but understand, even through the Japanese, he did not speak the tone of questioning and doubt and painful reassessment. He stood there in the darkness, listening to enemy prisoners question everything they had been taught, and he realized they were asking the same questions he was asking. They were wondering if the propaganda they had been fed was lies. They were wondering if the enemy was really as evil as they had been told. They were discovering that the world was more complicated than the narratives they had been given. "We are all prisoners," he thought, "prisoners of what we were told to believe, prisoners of the stories our countries told us about each other. And maybe the only way out is to question everything." That night, he started another letter he would not send immediately. This one was to Tommy, his dead brother, words he needed to say, even though Tommy would never read them. "Tommy," he wrote, "I wish you were here. I wish I could ask you what you think about all this. You died believing the Japanese were monsters. You died hating them. And maybe that hate was necessary. Maybe you could not have fought as hard as you did without it. But I am here now seeing them as people, and I do not know what to do with that. I do not know if it dishonors your memory to see them as human. I do not know if mercy is strength or weakness. I do not know anything anymore, except that the rules say to treat them with dignity, and so I do. And maybe that is enough. Maybe following the rules, even when it is hard, even when it feels wrong, is all we can do. I hope you understand. I hope wherever you are, you know I am trying to do right by you." He folded the letter and put it with the others in his footlocker. Then he finished his patrol and went to his quarters and lay awake thinking about these women, about their questions, about his own confusion about a war that had killed his brother, and left him here guarding prisoners who cried over hot water and questioned everything they had been told. The transformation was not complete. It was barely begun. But something had shifted. The wall between captor and captive, between American and Japanese, between us and them, had started to crack. Not break, not yet, but crack. And through those cracks, something unexpected was seeping in. Recognition. The recognition that on both sides of this war were human beings who had been told stories, who had believed lies, who were trying to make sense of a world that had promised them certainty and delivered only moral confusion. On the morning of November 20th, week 11 of their imprisonment, something changed. It started small. Emmy picked at her dinner the night before, leaving most of it uneaten. She looked tired, but many of them were tired. The psychological weight of captivity, of guilt, of confusion exhausted them all. Haruka had noticed but thought nothing of it. Grief affected appetite. They all had days when eating felt impossible despite the hunger. But when the morning bell rang at 6:30, Emmy did not get up. Women around her called her name, shook her shoulder gently at first, then with growing urgency. She stirred but did not wake properly. Her eyelids fluttered. Her lips moved without sound. When Fumiko pressed her hand to the girl's forehead, she pulled back as if burned. "She is very sick," Fumiko said quietly, her voice tight with controlled fear. "High fever, rapid pulse, breathing is shallow. We need help." The women looked at each other. They were prisoners. Would the Americans care if one of them was sick? Would they provide real medical care, or would they let her die? One less mouth to feed, one less enemy to guard. The question hung unspoken in the air as Fumiko went to find a guard. Minutes stretched like hours. Then footsteps approached, quick and purposeful. Sergeant Cartwright appeared in the doorway, took one look at Emmy's flushed face and labored breathing, and did not hesitate. His hand went to the radio on his belt. "This is Tower 3. Need medical to barracks 7 immediately. Female prisoner, juvenile, acute fever, respiratory distress." His voice was calm, professional, efficient. Not the voice of someone making a difficult decision, but of someone following protocol so ingrained it required no thought. The response crackled back. "Copy. Morrison en route." They watched Cartwright's face searching for signs of what would come next. He was not smiling, but he was not cold either. His expression showed nothing but professional focus, the look of a man doing his job exactly as he had been trained to do it. Within 10 minutes, Captain Richard Morrison arrived. He was 42 years old with gray streaking his dark hair at the temples and lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many suns, seeing too many wounded, making too many impossible decisions about who could be saved and who could not. He had been a medic at Bataan, had survived the death march that killed thousands of American prisoners, had watched men die of starvation and disease while their Japanese captors looked on with indifference or worse. He had every reason in the world to feel nothing for this Japanese girl burning with fever in an American camp. But Captain Morrison did not deal in reasons or revenge. He dealt in patience and protocols and the Hippocratic oath he had sworn long before the war taught him what hate felt like. He knelt beside Emmy's bunk, took her temperature, checked her pulse, listened to her breathing with a stethoscope pulled from his medical bag. His face remained professionally neutral, but his movements were quick and efficient, the movements of someone who recognized severity and would not waste time on deliberation. "Pneumonia," he said to his assistant, a young corporal who carried the stretcher. "Possibly severe. We need to move her to the infirmary immediately. Get an IV started. Prepare penicillin. We are not waiting to see if it gets worse." They brought a stretcher. As they lifted Emmy onto it, she opened her eyes, briefly confused, and frightened her gaze, searching the faces around her for something familiar, something safe. Haruka grabbed her hand before they could take her away. "You will be okay," she said in Japanese, not knowing if it was true, but needing to say it anyway, needing Emmy to hear words of hope, even if they might be lies. Emmy's hand was burning hot in hers, dry and papery, the hand of someone whose body was fighting a battle it might not win. Then they took her away, carrying her out of the barracks toward the camp's medical building, and Haruka was left standing there with the heat of Emmy's fever still radiating from her palm. The women spent that day in anxious uncertainty. They went through their work assignments mechanically, hands moving through familiar motions while minds spun elsewhere. In the library, Haruka reshelved the same books 3 times, unable to remember what she had already done. In the laundry, Fumiko scrubbed sheets with unnecessary force, trying to exhaust her body so her mind would stop imagining worse possibilities. In the kitchen, Cook Henderson worked alone, noting Emmy's absence, but saying nothing, just adjusting his prep work to account for missing hands. Would the Americans use precious medicine on a prisoner? Would they expend resources on a 17-year-old Japanese girl who had no strategic value, who was just one prisoner among many who represented the nation that had killed so many of their own? The questions circled endlessly, unanswerable, until time revealed the truth. That evening before dinner, Fumiko was allowed to visit the infirmary. She returned 30 minutes later with news that left the gathered women stunned into silence. "She is being treated with penicillin," Fumiko said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "The miracle drug. She has an intravenous line providing fluids. She is in a clean bed with nurses checking on her regularly. The doctor, Captain Morrison, he said her chances are good if the fever breaks in the next 24 hours. Penicillin." The word passed through the group like an electric current. They were using penicillin on a Japanese prisoner. The drug was expensive, precious, reserved for the most serious cases for patients whose lives were considered worth the cost. American soldiers received penicillin. Important officers, people with value and status in futures were saving. Yet they were using it to save Emmy, a girl with no strategic importance, no intelligence value, no bargaining power. Just one prisoner among many, one life in a war that had consumed millions. The implications were staggering, too large to process all at once, challenging every assumption about how enemies treated each other, about what value human life held when that life belonged to the other side. The next day was Thanksgiving, November 22nd. The Americans had a holiday, something about gratitude and harvest and giving thanks for blessings. The prisoners were given a special meal, food that seemed obscene in its abundance. Turkey with crispy golden skin, stuffing rich with sage and butter and chunks of bread, mashed potatoes whipped smooth and topped with gravy, cranberry sauce sweet and tart at once, and pumpkin pie, an American dessert they had never tasted before, spiced with cinnamon and topped with fresh whipped cream. They ate in silence, each bite carrying impossible weight, thinking about Emmy in the infirmary fighting for her life with American medicine in her veins, thinking about their families in Japan, about mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers eating nothing or eating scraps or eating whatever could be scavenged from the ruins, thinking about this strange world they inhabited where enemies fed them holiday feasts while their own people starved. Sergeant Cartwright took his break that afternoon and walked to the infirmary. He had no official reason to be there, no duties that required his presence. But he went anyway, drawn by something he could not articulate. He sat on a bench outside Emmy's room, not going in, just sitting, just being nearby. Captain Morrison came out after an hour, saw him there and paused. "You can go in if you want," Morrison said quietly. "She is sleeping, but company helps. Sometimes patients know when someone is there, even when they are not conscious. It makes a difference. I am not family." Cartwright said the words sounding weak even to his own ears. "Neither am I," Morrison replied. "But we are here anyway." They sat together in silence for a while, these two men, who had both lost something to this war, who had both seen things they could not unsee, who had both chosen to follow rules that demanded mercy, even when mercy felt impossible. On the morning of November 23rd, Haruka was shelving books in the library when she heard shouting from the direction of the infirmary. The sound cut through the quiet morning like a blade. Her heart stopped. The book in her hands fell to the floor. She ran without thinking, abandoning her cart, her post, everything, just running toward that sound. Other women emerged from various work details, drawn by the same terrible urgency. They converged on the infirmary, a crowd gathering outside the medical building. A guard held them back, but through the open door they could see people moving quickly, urgently, medical personnel rushing with equipment and tense faces. Then Fumiko emerged from the building. Her face was stricken, drained of color, empty of hope. She walked toward them slowly as if her legs barely supported her weight, and the women pressed forward, desperate for news, desperate for anything except the truth they could already read in her expression. Fumiko's voice was barely a whisper. She stopped breathing. They could not find a pulse. "She is gone." The words hit like physical blows. Several women began to cry immediately, hands covering mouths, bodies folding inward against grief. Others stood frozen in shock, unable to process, unable to accept. Emmy. Young, kind, shy Emmy, who had cried while eating her first full meal in months, who had learned to make biscuits and smiled for the first time since capture, who represented something innocent in this place of war and imprisonment. Gone. The old suspicions flooded back with terrible force. Maybe the Americans had not really tried. Maybe it had all been for show, a performance of mercy with no substance behind it. Maybe they had let her die because in the end, she was just an enemy prisoner, just a Japanese girl whose life meant nothing to them. The guard who had been holding them back stepped aside. It was Cartwright, and his face showed something they had not seen before. Not professionalism, not distance, grief. He looked grieved. "You can see her," he said through Lieutenant Nakamura, who had arrived to translate. "You can say goodbye." They filed into the infirmary in a silent line, moving like mourners in a funeral procession. They were led to a small room where Emmy lay on a hospital bed covered with a white sheet pulled up to her chin. Her face was peaceful, all the fear and confusion finally gone, leaving behind only stillness. She looked younger in death than she had in life, as if dying had erased the war from her features and returned her to the child she had been before any of this began. Haruka knelt beside the bed, tears streaming down her face unchecked. She reached out and took Emmy's hand. It was already cooling the heat of fever, replaced by the cold of absence. Around her, others wept openly, no longer trying to maintain dignity or control, just letting grief pour out in waves. They had survived so much. War and defeat and capture, and the long journey across the Pacific and the uncertainty of imprisonment. But they had not been able to save one young woman from illness. And in that moment, Haruka felt the weight of every loss, every death, every moment of suffering from the entire war, pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. "She is gone," someone sobbed behind her. The words were repeated, passing through the room like a dirge, like a prayer. "She is gone. She is gone." Haruka closed her eyes and let the tears fall. She did not try to stop them, did not try to maintain the composure she had fought so hard to preserve. What was the point? What was dignity in the face of death? What was any of it worth? Then she heard footsteps, quick, urgent footsteps approaching fast, a voice with an American accent cutting through the grief. "Wait, everyone, wait, do not move her." Haruka turned to see Captain Morrison pushing his way through the circle of grieving women. He carried his medical bag and his face was intense, focus burning with a determination that seemed almost angry. He shouldered past them, not roughly but with clear purpose, and bent over Emmy's body. "What is he doing?" someone whispered. "She is dead. Let her rest." But Morrison ignored them. He pulled back the sheet, placed two fingers against Emmy's throat, pressing harder than seemed necessary, harder than seemed kind. He bent his head close, listening. Seconds passed. They held their breath, not understanding what he was looking for, knowing only that something had shifted in the room, some possibility had opened that they did not dare name. Then Morrison's eyes widened, his whole body tensed. There he breathed. There it is. Faint, but there. She has got a pulse. He looked up at his nurse with fierce intensity. "Get the oxygen. Get the adrenaline. Now!" The nurse moved instantly, grabbing equipment from a nearby cart. The women stared in stunned incomprehension as Morrison began working over Emmy's body with practiced speed, his hands moving in patterns they did not understand but could recognize, as purposeful as fighting, as refusing to accept what seemed inevitable. "But we checked," Fumiko stammered, her voice breaking. There was no pulse. She was not breathing. We were certain. Morrison glanced up at her for just a second, his hands never stopping their work. "Weak pulse, shallow breathing," he said quickly. "In a severely weakened patient, it can be almost impossible to detect without the right equipment and experience. I have seen it before at Bataan. American POWs so weak we thought they were dead. She is not gone yet, but she will be if we do not work fast." They were ushered out of the room as more medical personnel swarmed in. They waited outside, no longer crying but suspended in a strange state between grief and hope. Was it possible? Could Emmy still be alive? They had been so certain. They had said their goodbyes. They had mourned. And now this American doctor was telling them they were wrong, that there was still a chance that death had not yet claimed her. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening, afternoon turning to evening. They waited. No one could work. No one could eat. They sat in small clusters around the camp, talking in low voices about what they had witnessed, what it meant, whether hope was more cruel than certainty, when hope might be false. Sergeant Cartwright stood near the infirmary, officially on duty, but really just waiting like everyone else. He thought about Tommy. He thought about Susie. He thought about these women who had come here expecting torture and found something they could not categorize or understand. He thought about Captain Morrison in that room, fighting to save a life that did not owe him anything, that represented a nation that had brutalized his friends, that should have meant nothing to him except one more enemy prisoner. But it did mean something. That was what the Geneva Convention promised. That every life, even enemy lives, had value. That rules mattered even when following them was hard. That mercy was not weakness, but the highest form of strength, the thing that separated civilization from barbarism, America from its enemies. As evening fell, Captain Morrison emerged from the infirmary. He looked exhausted, wrung out his uniform, soaked with sweat, but his eyes held satisfaction, the look of a man who had fought a battle and won. "She is stable," he announced through Lieutenant Nakamura. "The fever broke. Her breathing is stronger. She is not out of danger yet. Recovery will be long, but she is fighting. She is going to make it. The relief was overwhelming. Women embraced each other and wept with joy, with gratitude, with emotions too large and complicated to name. Fumiko approached Morrison, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Thank you," she said in halting English words she had practiced but rarely used. "Thank you for saving her. Thank you for caring." Morrison looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, as if he did not quite know what to do with it. "It is my job," he said simply. "She is my patient. Of course I care." But Haruka understood that it was more than a job. He could have accepted their assessment that Emmy was dead. No one would have blamed him. She was, after all, an enemy prisoner. Instead, he had fought for her life with the same intensity he would have used for an American soldier, perhaps with more intensity, because the stakes were higher, because proving that the rules mattered required him to care even when caring was hardest. He had used valuable medicine, valuable time, valuable effort to save one Japanese girl. And in doing so, he had shattered something fundamental in these women's understanding of the world. He had shown them that mercy was not propaganda, that American promises about following rules and treating prisoners with dignity were not lies designed to confuse them, but truths that American officers took seriously enough to fight death itself in order to uphold them. That night, the barracks buzzed with conversations that went late into the darkness. They talked about what they had witnessed, what it meant, how it changed everything they thought they knew. Haruka lay in her bunk and wrote in her diary by the dim light of the single bulb. "Today we learned that the enemy will fight to save us, even when we have given up," she wrote. "Today we learned that to them, we are not just bodies to be processed and contained, but lives worth saving. I do not know what to do with this knowledge. It breaks something in me. It breaks the neat categories of us and them, good and evil, victor and vanquished. If they can fight this hard to save Emmy, what else have we been wrong about? What else is possible in his quarters?" Sergeant Carteret also wrote, not a letter he would hesitate to send this time, but one he would mail immediately, urgent and necessary. "Sarah, something happened today that I need to tell you about. We almost lost one of the prisoners, the youngest girl, 17 years old. Doc Morrison fought to save her like she was Tommy. No more than that, like she was Susie. He refused to let her die even when we all thought she was already gone. And he won." The women wept when he told them. "Sarah, I watched the enemy become human today. And I think I did too. Tommy died hating them. But I think he would understand why I cannot. I think he would want me to follow the rules, to stay human, to honor his sacrifice by being better than the hate that killed him. I hope I am right about that. I need to believe I am right. Your loving husband, James." Weeks passed. Emmy recovered slowly, her strength returning in small increments. By mid-December, she could walk without assistance. By January, she was back in the kitchen, helping cook Henderson prepare meals, though he would not let her work as hard as before. She had become something precious to him, this girl whose life he had watched Morrison fight for. Evidence that the war had not taken everything. In early spring of 1946, repatriation orders arrived. The women would return to Japan in phases, sent home by ship to various ports. They were given supplies for the journey. New clothes, toiletries, food rations. The Americans were sending them home in better condition than they had arrived. On the last night before the first group was scheduled to leave, the women gathered in the barracks for an informal farewell. Those leaving and those staying behind shared what little they had. The last pieces of chocolate from the canteen. The final cigarettes. They talked about what they would tell people back home, how they would describe their time as prisoners. "I will tell the truth," Fumiko said firmly, "that we were treated according to the rules of war, that we were fed and housed and given medical care. If people think that makes us traitors, so be it. The truth is the truth." Others nodded, though some looked uncertain. In a defeated Japan, such truths might be dangerous. They might be seen as propaganda, as collaboration, as betrayal. "I will tell them about Captain Morrison," Emmy said quietly, "about how he would not give up even when we had. I will tell them that the enemy fought to save my life. Whatever else people need to know about the war, they need to know that." The next morning, Haruka stood with the others, who were not yet scheduled to leave, watching as the first group boarded trucks for the journey to the port. She had said goodbye to Emmy the night before, had hugged her tightly, wished her well. Now she watched the trucks pull away and felt a profound sense of loss. Not just for the friends departing, but for the strange safety of this place. When her own turn came 2 weeks later, Haruka packed her small bundle of possessions, a warm sweater, some writing paper, a photograph one of the guards had taken of all the women together. She packed these carefully, knowing they represented not just objects, but memories, evidence of a time that would seem unreal when she was home. The journey back across the Pacific was different from the journey over. They were still prisoners, in a sense still under guard, but the atmosphere had changed. They were going home, whatever that meant, wherever that would lead. The ship was a military transport, crowded and uncomfortable, but they had food and water and space to sleep. In its way, another reminder of American resources and organization. Haruka eventually found her family in Tokyo. They had survived, barely living in the ruins of their bombed neighborhood. Her mother wept when she saw her, held her close, asked where she had been. Haruka told the truth, as much of it as she could. She described the camp, the food, the treatment. Her mother listened in silence, her face unreadable. Finally, her mother spoke. "You were fortunate," she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, only statement of fact. "Many were not so fortunate. But you survived and came home, and now we rebuild together." It was acceptance. And Haruka felt something in her chest loosen a tension she had not known she was carrying. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived for Sergeant James Cartwright. It was from Sarah, his wife, and when he opened it, his hands were shaking. "James," she had written, "I received your letter about the Befriends girl, about Dr. Morrison, about what you witnessed. I need to tell you something. I should have told you long ago. Tommy wrote me a letter before he died. I never showed you because it hurt too much, because I thought you needed the anger to get through this war. But now I see I was wrong. Tommy said, if I do not make it, tell Jimmy not to carry hate for me. Tell him to remember that the best way to honor me is to stay human." He saw things in the Pacific that changed him, James. Things he could not write about. But in the end, he understood that hate would destroy him faster than any bullet. He wanted you to be better than that. I think you did that, James. I think you honored Tommy exactly right. Come home. Susie asks for you every night. We are waiting. Your loving wife, Sarah. Cartwright read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket next to his heart. That night, he walked to the barracks where the remaining women still lived. He did not go inside, just stood outside in the darkness, listening to them talk in their language. He did not understand, thinking about his brother, who had wanted him to stay human, thinking about these women who had taught him what that meant. Years later, long after the war had faded into history, the women who had been prisoners in that California camp would still remember those months with complicated emotions. Emmy returned to her village, married, had children. She told her grandchildren about the American doctor who saved her life, about the strange months when the enemy showed mercy. When they asked her why, she would say, because they had rules. And rules properly followed can be more powerful than weapons. Fumiko became a nurse again, working to rebuild Japan's medical system. She always insisted on proper procedures, always remembered that rules mattered, that treating people with dignity mattered. When younger nurses asked why she was so strict, she would tell them about a camp in California where the enemy followed rules even when they did not have to, and how that had taught her what civilization really meant. Captain Morrison returned to Ohio, opened a medical practice in a small town. He kept a photograph in his office, a grainy black and white image of the camp infirmary. When patients asked about it, he would say simply, "A place I worked during the war." But he would not elaborate, would not explain that sometimes late at night, he still saw that Japanese girl's face, still felt the faint pulse under his fingers, still remembered choosing to fight when everyone else had given up. Some victories, he had learned, mattered more than others. Sergeant Cartwright went home to Sarah and Susie. He never spoke much about his time at the camp, but he kept the letters, both the ones he sent and the ones he received. In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, he sat down and wrote one final letter. Mrs. Haruka Tanaka. He addressed it using the married name he had learned through patient research and help from former military translators. He did not know if the letter would reach her, did not know if she was still alive, but he needed to write it anyway. I hope this finds you well. I wanted you to know that Sarah and I named our grandson Thomas James after my brother, but with a new understanding. We have told him about the war, but we have also told him about the camp, about the women we guarded, about a young girl named Emmy who nearly died and was saved. We have told him that hate is easy and mercy is hard, but that America is built on choosing the hard path. He will never carry hate. That is my promise to my brother and to you. That is how we honor the dead, by refusing to let hate be their only legacy. Your friend Jim Cartwright. The letter found Haruka 3 months later. She was 64 years old, a grandmother herself living in a small apartment in Tokyo. When she opened it and saw who it was from, she sat down and wept. Not from sadness, but from something she could not quite name. Recognition, perhaps, or gratitude, or simply the relief of knowing that someone else remembered that she was not alone in carrying those memories. She wrote back, told him about her life, about her family, about how the experience had shaped everything she became. Told him she had kept her diary from that time, that she had written down everything that someday her grandchildren would read it and understand. They exchanged letters for the next 10 years until Cartwright's death in 1985. Each letter was brief, careful, but honest. Two people who had been on opposite sides of a war, learning that the lines drawn by conflict were less permanent than the connections forged by shared humanity. When Haruka died in 2005, her granddaughter found the diary while sorting through her belongings. It was wrapped in cloth, protected, and preserved. Inside, pressed between pages, were three things: a photograph of 127 women standing in an American prisoner of war camp, arranged in neat rows, their faces showing something complicated. Not quite smiling, but not broken either. Alive. A letter from James Cartwright dated 1975, speaking of grandsons and promises and refusing to let hate win. And a final diary entry written the night before Haruka left the camp to return to Japan. We came here expecting death or degradation, she had written in careful characters. We found instead a different kind of defeat, the defeat of our certainties, our hatreds, our simple stories about who we were and who they were. Is that better or worse than physical defeat? I cannot say. But I know that I will carry this with me always. This knowledge that the enemy could be kind, that mercy could come from unexpected sources, that the most dangerous weapon might be the one that challenges everything you believe, and that sometimes in the darkest moments of war, humanity persists, not because it is strategic, not because it serves some larger purpose, but because people choose it, because America chose it, because men like Captain Morrison and Sergeant Cartwright chose to follow rules even when it would have been easier to break them. Because the Geneva Convention was not just words on paper, but a promise that real people kept. We expected torture and received treatment. We expected degradation and received dignity. We expected death and received life. In the gap between expectation and reality, our entire understanding of the war, the enemy, and ourselves was transformed. That transformation was painful, confusing, profoundly destabilizing. But it was also, in its own way, a kind of liberation. Liberation from hate, from the lies we had been told, from the certainty that there was only one way to see the world. I do not know what history will say about this war. I do not know how America will be remembered. But I know what I saw, I know what I experienced, and I know that the choice to be better, to follow rules even when dealing with those who ignored them, to fight for the life of an enemy prisoner, as if she were your own daughter, that choice matters. That choice is what American exceptionalism really means. Not perfection, not moral superiority, but the choice again and again, day after day, to be better, to follow the rules even when it is hard, to see the humanity in the enemy, to refuse to let hate win. That is what I will carry home with me. That is what I will tell my children if I am blessed to have them. And that is what I hope history remembers. Not just that America won the war, but how America treated those it defeated. Haruka's granddaughter read the diary 3 times. Then she translated it into English and published it with the photograph and the letters as a book. The title was simple, The Pulse of Mercy. It became required reading in some American high schools, taught alongside other accounts of the Second World War. Not because it made America look perfect, but because it showed something true. That in war's darkest moments, when hate would have been justified, when cruelty would have been understandable, some people chose differently. They chose to follow rules, to see the human in the enemy, to fight for lives that did not owe them anything, to prove that civilization could survive even in wartime, that mercy was not weakness, that the content of one's character was revealed not in victory, but in how one treated the defeated. And that choice, made by ordinary men and women in a California prisoner of war camp in 1945, echoed across generations. A reminder that the world is more complicated than we want it to be, that our enemies are human, that the most powerful weapon might not be force but the simple decision to treat people with dignity even when everything tells us not to, especially when everything tells us not to, because that is when it matters most.